The date is the 14th of October, 1066. The Norman ships are anchored along the shore of Pevensey, southern England. An army of at least 7,000 men are marching through the Sussex countryside, travelling to a field to meet the Anglo-Saxons, who have recently defeated the last of the Vikings only 2 weeks earlier at Stamford Bridge. The battle that will unfold here will determine the entire future of England, and indeed Europe, as Harold Godwinson meets his foe, William of Normandy, at a place which would go on to be aptly named Battle. The Saxons position themselves defensively atop a ridge, forcing the Norman invaders to march up the hill in order to meet their opponents in combat. Harold deploys his shield wall, which makes any offensive attacks by both infantry and cavalry almost unimpactful. The Normans do not give up. Instead, they crash into the Saxon lines again and again, ruthlessly attempting to puncture a hole in the seemingly impenetrable shield wall, but are warded off every time. The repeating calls for retreat lure the Saxons into a false sense of confidence, with some warriors believing that they could chase the Norman opponents down the hill to cut them down as they retreat, believing that this would be an attempt to lower the numbers of Norman soldiers as much as possible, rendering further regroups and advances weaker after each retreat. It is believed that this was the turning point of the battle. Another Norman retreat led the Saxons to break away from their defensive position up upon the hill and chase down the Normans. But this, however, was just a feint, as the Normans suddenly turned round and re-engaged the Saxons who had broken out of their lines and were now undefended. Many Saxon warriors were cut down in quick succession, stranded out in the open as Norman cavalry killed them in droves, with showers of arrow fire taking even more Saxon lives with each volley. Harold Godwinson himself was struck in the eye by an arrow, before quickly being carried back to relative safety by his Hussars. The Normans immediately pounced on this opportunity, and forced their way to the Saxon king, slaughtering his household guards before butchering him as he lay on the ground. As calls bellowed out that Harold Godwinson was dead, the remaining Saxon warriors continued fighting for their lives, albeit with broken hearts and broken spirits. The Norman war machine pushed forward, cutting down the Saxons as the fields turned red with blood. Victory was soon proclaimed, and the day belonged to the Normans, and England was now under new management. There is much to be said about the fallout after the Battle of Hastings. One of William's first acts as the new King of England was to abolish slavery, deeming it unchristian, and ushering in a new era of religious adherence, levelling up the Christian work that the Anglo-Saxons had previously done in the last few centuries. The Normans brought in a new era for England, replacing the previous earldoms with the feudal system, a hierarchy of classes which allowed for a nationwide system of law and order to be invoked. The few Saxon earls who bent the knee to the Duke of Normandy were allowed to keep their lands, as long as they paid homage to the new king. However, the vast majority of England was divvied up and shared out between the various Norman nobles who had pledged allegiance with William and fought alongside him at the Battle of Hastings. The feudal system paved the way for extreme details of data collection to take place, as seen with the introduction of the Domesday Book in the 1080s. The Domesday Book was a near-complete set of records from every city, town, village and hamlet, recording how many households, horses, fish ponds, chickens, goats, sheep, oxen, geese and pretty much every form of livestock and commodity that had a value to it and could therefore be taxed. The sheer level of record keeping that was initiated thanks to the Domesday Book is near impossible to comprehend for the 11th century, and survives today as one of the largest data collecting programs ever to occur during England's entire history. The Domesday Book was essentially a handbook for Norman feudalism. Every square mile of England was surveyed, and the values of each commodity and estate were totted up, after which the king gave a shire to each of his barons, who in turn gave those lands within those shires to their trusted knights. The knights would then rent these lands out to the peasantry, or villeins, who would then pay taxes to the knights, who then paid taxes to the barons, who would then forward these taxes on to the kingdom. peasants are often regarded as poor and squalid due to their low status on the societal ladder. But this would be oversimplifying a very broad range of lower classes who made up the vast majority of England's population. The word peasant simply refers to someone who makes their money off the land, usually through forms of agriculture. There were indeed peasants who lived in small humble hovels, and also those who lived in large houses and had their own servants. And of course, the indigenous Saxon population were generally considered lower social status than the Norman equivalents who had emigrated to England following the victory at Hastings. In truth, it just depended on where you lived and what natural phenomena impacted your daily lives. Most peasants lived by water, such as lakes or rivers, so fish like trout and salmon would commonly be on the menu, supported with a lot of locally grown vegetables, butter, bread and cheese. During times of hardship, of course, such as a prolonged rainy season or a cold snap, times were most definitely hard for anyone who made their living from working outside. But it is important to remember that we look back at the past through a modern lens, where generally we live much safer and domesticated lives, and we have peace of mind where food and drink are always available to us. People living during the Middle Ages would never know of these securities, so they wouldn't consider themselves hard done by during harsh winters where food was scarce, as it was simply a very real and natural risk for them in their daily lives. Immediately after claiming the Kingdom of England in 1066, the Normans began constructing castles all over the country. The main style of castle during the 11th century was the motte and bailey, a classic Norman design where the knight or baron would live in a fortified house called a keep or a donjon on top of a tall man-made earth mound called a motte. By the late 1100s, some keeps grew to become large dominating stone towers like what you see here at Hedingham Castle in Essex, which survives as one of the best preserved 12th century Norman keeps in all of England. The motte had stairs going down to a large forecourt called a bailey, which had a plethora of necessary buildings inside such as a blacksmith, stable, mustering hall and chapel. The bailey was then enclosed in a wooden palisade wall often built on top of a ring of earthworks with either a dry or water-filled ditch encircling the entire network of earthworks, which was known as a moat. These castles were a perfect way of solidifying the Norman claim over the local land, with the keep functioning as a sentry point to keep an eye on the peasantry, as well as being a constant reminder of the Norman military rule on the skyline. The motte and bailey castles would often house a small garrison of knights or lightly armoured mounted soldiers called hobblars, who would ride out to quash any local rebellions and enforce the law. While a castle may be the baron's or knight's official residence, they may often choose to live elsewhere in manor houses, which were generally larger and more domestic, filled with home comforts rather than being designed specifically for military purposes. Hidden in the Norfolk countryside resides one of only two 12th century Norman manor houses left surviving to the modern day. This is Weeting Castle, and despite its name it was never formally a castle and was not built with defence in mind. The moat was a later 13th century addition. The manor was built by the de Place family, who wanted to demonstrate their wealth and power in the local area. The rectangular building consisted of a grand hall which took up the majority of the space, which was attached to the kitchens on the first floor and the bedchambers above, accessible by outside stairs leading to the entrance. Dotted around the manor house would be storerooms, stables and various semi-permanent farmyard buildings which were all looked after by the groundsmen who lived on site. During the Middle Ages, piety was incredibly important, especially for the upper classes. In the medieval period, religion wasn't just a faith, it was also a powerful political tool. As the new Norman regime saw the lands change hands from the previous Saxons to the new foreign occupiers, a way to keep peace and order in the local area was for the new lords to build something for the use of the local population. Roads, bridges, fairways, schools and hospitals were all easy crowd pleasers, but by far the most popular choice for Norman lords were churches. Building a chapel or church was also seen as a ticket to heaven, so most lords would build at least one church on their land. Out of this comes an interesting little quirk. as there are some places in England where not one, but two or even more churches stand right next to each other, sharing the same courtyard. This is believed to be because, despite a lord wanting to build a church to show his piety to God and gain favour with the clergy, building it in the middle of his land would also require building roads and possibly bridges to access the church for the local people. Often they would instead choose to construct the church right on the edge of their property, as there may already be a functional road in place. So when you see two churches in very close proximity to each other, like here in South Walsham, Norfolk, you are likely seeing the place where two local lords' boundaries meet. Of course, if you want to go one further to prove your faith in your deity, and truly secure your place in heaven, you'd opt to build something bigger than a simple church. One of the most lasting gifts that the Normans gave England were cathedrals. Monastic giants dominated the landscape for miles around. These gigantic churches were the most expensive, most time-consuming and most demanding structures ever comprehended in European history since the Roman Empire. Indeed, the Normans borrowed the Romanesque architectural styles, with rounded arches and blind arcading for added decoration in the masonry. Cathedrals were mostly built over a period of 100 to 200 years, and the majority being finished sometime during the late 12th century and going well into the 13th century just for the original body of the church to be completed, let alone the near constant upkeep, renovations and architectural changes that each cathedral went under all throughout the medieval period. Catholicism was the superior branch of Christianity during the Norman period, and Catholics believed in showing off the splendour and beauty of God through artistic expression, finding any way they could to channel their artistic tendencies through ever more ambitious construction projects. Of course, over time, these cathedrals would pay for themselves as they quickly became famous tourist attractions for pilgrims from all over Europe, with entire industries catering to these religious travellers through inns, taverns, the selling of souvenirs, and charging to see various religious relics such as the bones of saints or other holy objects housed within the cathedrals. The construction of these monolithic projects brought a great source of income to the cities that hosted them, and in turn played a part in allowing these cities to wield a large amount of power and influence over other aspects of medieval life, such as politics and trade.
Almost as soon as William the Conqueror had established the Norman rule over England, they then turned their sights towards Wales, which was generally considered to be a wild and mountainous land, yet filled with treasures such as high-quality pasture lands for agriculture, as well as gold and peat mines, which are essential trading commodities. The king entrusted 3 of his closest nobles, Hugh de Avranches, Roger de Montgomery, and William Fitzosborne, to take armies into Wales across Offa's Dyke, which was an earthwork border from the previous Saxon period which separated England from Wales. Immediately, the 3 Norman lords began constructing motte-and-bailey castles all across the southeastern border of Wales to slowly establish rule and take over land from the natives. Many castles were built in Monmouthshire, Glamorgan and Flintshire, before continuing to move further west to Carmarthenshire and even Pembrokeshire. Today, many of these castles still survive, with some of the most impressive being Usk, Pembroke and Chepstow. The invasion of Wales proved to be somewhat harder than conquering England, as the Welsh tribes were particularly aggressive and relentless, constantly besieging the Norman castles, sometimes even as they were still being built. Indeed, the castle at Usk changed hands multiple times throughout its first 100 years as the Welsh continued to attack it on a regular basis. Over in Carmarthenshire, Kidwelly Castle was also under siege during its early years, and despite being built as a near impregnable fortress, it fell to a Prince of Wales named Lord Rhys in 1159. Lord Rhys was an expert military leader and came from a family of knights who proved their soul against the invading Normans. Due to this uprising, the Normans found themselves constantly flipping which lands they held, and almost every other year a castle would be built and then another castle would be besieged and often taken over. It is largely thanks to Lord Rhys that the Normans never truly took full control of Wales. The land was instead later integrated with England through diplomacy, acting as a principality rather than under full ownership. While sending campaigns into Wales, the Normans began to have troubles at home. As between 1138 and 1153, a civil war broke out in England which became known as the Anarchy. It began due to a grave accident at sea when William Adelin, who was the only legitimate son of King Henry I, drowned whilst aboard the White Ship in 1120, which sank in the English Channel. Upon the king's death in 1135, the crown was passed to his daughter, Empress Matilda. However, many of the nobility would not recognise her as the rightful heir to the throne, and during the disagreements, Stephen of Blois, who was the nephew of the recently deceased king, snatched the throne with the help of his brother, who was the Bishop of Winchester, and therefore was a person with exceedingly important political power. Stephen and Matilda both raised armies, with Stephen largely being backed by rebellious barons from England, Wales and Scotland, and Matilda's forces mainly consisting of English and French loyalists. Many years of fighting ensued without much strategic victory for either side. Matilda had established her borders around southern England and East Anglia, and it was during this time where we see an increase in fortifications of various castles around this area. Castle Rising saw its earthworks greatly heightened, and the castle at Eye in Suffolk had its wooden palisade walls replaced with stone after various skirmishes in the local area between the two armies. Hugh Bigot, a knight who owned multiple castles in East Anglia, including his main home here at Framlingham, Suffolk, had at first sided with Stephen and proved to be a very politically aggressive figure throughout the Anarchy. Perhaps too aggressive, as when false news spread of Stephen's death in 1136, Hugh laid siege to Norwich Castle, seizing it for a while before Stephen quickly marched an army towards Framlingham, and laid siege to Bigot's own castle, forcing the rebellious lord to surrender. In an attempt to regain favour with Stephen, Hugh fought with him at the First Battle of Lincoln in 1141, but then decided to desert and instead captured King Stephen himself, for which he was granted the earldom of Norfolk by Empress Matilda, and, rather ironically, given the keys to Norwich Castle, the fortress he had previously laid siege to. Matilda's son Henry, Duke of Normandy, had now come of age and travelled from France with an army to assert his own claim to the throne, and immediately entered conflict by besieging various castles in England. Agreements were drawn between Stephen and Henry, as Stephen conceded that Henry should take the throne after his death. And on the 25th of October 1154, Stephen passed away and the crown was handed down to Henry, who became King Henry II. The new king immediately began work on restoring England, which had just been subjected to a generation of warfare and conflict. Mercenaries were disbanded, many unauthorised castles were demolished, and many steps were made to restore the treasuries. Within a decade or so later, England's financial situation had more or less recovered and once again was a prosperous kingdom. The 13th century was indeed a shaky time for England. A string of mismanagement of lands, nearsighted decisions and overstretching of military presence in foreign countries saw the English kings delve ever more into uncertainty and general distrust of the population. This can clearly be seen in the reign of King Richard I, who reigned from 1189 to 1199, where Richard was shot by a crossbowman while he was besieging a castle in France. Richard's reign of England was lacklustre at best. He himself was French and had no desire for living in England. It is said that he only ever spent around 2 weeks in England during his 10-year reign. He was a military leader, a warmonger and a warrior. He had no interest in politics. All he wanted to do was spend money on military campaigns crusading in the Middle East and expanding the English domination over France. Due to this, he seemingly didn't spend any time providing an heir to the throne, so when he died, the crown passed to his brother, John. John as well was no perfect king, indeed, far from it. He was considered a jealous and vengeful person to people who knew him. He cared more about himself and his own inner circle than the needs of a larger population. His continuous selfish manoeuvres both politically and militarily in France and with the Papal State, coupled with his failure to listen to his professional team of experts, led to an implosion of English dominance on the European scene. He picked fights with the wrong people in France, causing him to lose much of his lands in mainland Europe, of which belonged mostly to the retinue of barons who were becoming increasingly irritated with the king's lack of foresight. John also lost favour with the Pope after a heavily misjudged attempt to make his personal friend, John de Grey, the next Archbishop of Canterbury, despite the Papal State putting up their own preferred candidate, Stephen Langton. The king desperately needed friends in high places to help him push through the decisions on important matters, and he believed that the title of King of England would be enough to enforce his preference in the next Archbishop. He, however, was horribly wrong, as after John attempted to exile Langton from England to ensure that he couldn't become the next Archbishop, the Pope became infuriated with the king's actions and excommunicated him, effectively calling the King of England and all those who follow him the enemy of the Church, which was a brandishment of severe shame, only embarrassing his barons even further and igniting a flame which would see the near-total collapse of England. John returned to England in 1215 following another defeat in France, where the French king Philip Augustus had now become the undisputed ruler of France. Upon his return, the fury of the English barons overspilled and many declared a rebellion upon the king. This rebellion was led by Robert Fitzwalter, and England was now suddenly plunged into an all-out civil war. The barons were wealthy, owned many castles around England, and had many connections with France. The rebellion's aim was to reform England, force John to accept the guidance of the court and relieve himself from much decision-making in an attempt to get the country back on track, and, of course, to rebuild the power and finances that the barons had lost at the hands of the king's wrongdoings. Heavy fighting ensued, with a very high number of sieges taking place as castles changed hands all over the country. One of the most notable of these sieges was here at Hedingham Castle in Essex in 1216. At the time, Hedingham was much more fortified than just the grand Norman keep that you see here today. It also had a ringwork of outer defences, and a particularly curious story of raining fish is attributed with this siege. Many castles had their own fish ponds as a source of food, but it is said that Hedingham had a large fish pond which was accessible via a tunnel which led into the castle. The Norman defenders were so confident that they could outlast any siege that they began throwing fish down at the attackers in an act of boastfulness in an attempt to lower the morale of John's men. Unfortunately for the barons' men, the castle was soon taken over shortly after the siege began. This was the way of England throughout 1215. The country was effectively a giant chessboard of trading castles. An attempt was made to put an end to the rebellion in June of 1215 with the issuing of the Magna Carta, possibly the most famous piece of legislation which actually proved to be very unimportant at the time. The Magna Carta, or Great Charter, was a legal agreement granting certain rights and liberties to individuals like lords and barons, and to help prevent the king from making decisions that angered his population. The agreement was signed by King John and then almost immediately annulled, confirming it was indeed relatively pointless at the time, whereas it did have good intentions. But of course the Magna Carta is highly valued in the modern day as it provides a key insight into the issues and turmoil that England was in during King John's reign. Some barons later conspired to aid a French invasion which was brewing from the south. Letters were sent to Prince Louis effectively inviting him to land in England, which he did in 1216. Now the French, the baron rebels and the royal army were all manoeuvring around the countryside, taking towns and castles. In fact, Prince Louis even entered London and was, albeit unofficially, pronounced the King of England at St Paul's Cathedral. Despite the French invasion going well at this point, Louis knew that Dover was the key to taking England. Fortunately, Dover Castle was a formidable stronghold, and when the French army attempted to besiege the castle beginning July 19, 1216, they were met with significant English resistance. After a long 3-month siege, Louis called off the attack and left, for now. Shortly after the first siege of Dover, King John contracted dysentery and died at Newark Castle on the 18th of October 1216. His son, Henry, was proclaimed to be the new King of England at the age of just 9 years old, but luckily he had the guidance of a very well-seasoned knight named Sir William Marshall, who became his justiciar and advisor for running the country. This proved to be a significant factor for the healing of England, as a revised version of the Magna Carta was soon released, which brought a lot of rebellious barons together in aid of the kingdom, and moved away from their previous ties with the French invaders. During a second siege of Dover Castle in 1217, William Marshal along with some other unified barons took forces north to Lincoln, which was currently being held by the French, and invoked a crushing victory over the French defenders. This victory significantly reduced Louis's power in England, and soon after, the second siege of Dover also failed. Furthermore, when the French army resigned to their ships on the south coast of England, they were swiftly met with the English fleet led by Marshal, who defeated them at sea. So the French invasion of England had been quashed, and the disagreements of the barons were beginning to be corrected one by one under the reign of King Henry III and his loyal advisor, William Marshal. Surely now, England would finally enter a state of peace. The Second Barons' Rebellion began in 1264 as anger boiled over again between the barons and the king. To be fair, there had just been half a century of Henry III's reign without much infighting in England. However, this is not to say that the barons were happy with the king by any means. Signs had begun to show for some time as Henry continued to be ever more increasingly influenced by the French. He began giving special privileges to his French lords, seemingly overlooking his own nobility from England. At the same time, he was also losing further lands in France, proving to be no more competent than his predecessor John, and one baron in particular had had enough. Simon de Montfort was the Earl of Leicester, and a powerful baron in England. He had been a close friend with the king, even a brother-in-law as he married Henry's wife, Eleanor, who herself had been previously married to William Marshal. As tensions increased, de Montfort raised an army against Henry and travelled around England finding and burning coffers which contained the papers detailing the barons' debts to the king. On the 14th of May 1264, Simon de Montfort won a victory over King Henry at the Battle of Lewes, where he even managed to capture the king, and therefore de Montfort now had the leverage to demand the change he had fought for. First, Simon declared that all debts of the barons were cancelled, which gained him significant support among the barons of England. Secondly, he set up a government which curbed the king's authority, enforcing all political decisions to be put forward to a council in Parliament. This caused a fallout between him and the Welsh Marcher Lords, as they were good friends with the royalty at the time, so they sided with King Henry III, who managed to then raise an army against Simon and fight back. The Second Barons' Revolt climaxed on the 4th of August 1265 at the Battle of Evesham. King Henry's son, Prince Edward, had organised a small retinue of loyal knights to enter the battle with just one goal: hunt down and kill Simon de Montfort. As the battle ensued, the knights did indeed find Simon. One of the knights, named Roger Mortimer, lunged a lance through de Montfort's neck. In the aftermath of the battle, de Montfort's body was heavily mutilated by a vengeful frenzy by the king's knights. The remains of his body were then buried at Evesham Abbey, where it in turn quickly became a pilgrimage destination until King Henry put a stop to it by exhuming de Montfort's body and reburying him elsewhere. Of course, the silver lining to all these civil wars and uprisings was that the castles got significantly stronger and had evolved into the massive fortifications that we see today. Many castles received stronger walls, larger keeps and extra towers to make them near impregnable, often influenced by the various castles over in France and the Crusader fortresses of the Middle East. One of the main characters responsible for the refortification of England was Prince Edward, who became King Edward I after his father Henry III had died in 1272. Edward I proved to be an incredibly successful king. He was a military asset who put a temporary end to various Welsh rebellions by implementing the Iron Ring, a series of heavily fortified castles made for one thing and one thing only: to keep the Welsh under control. The four biggest castles in the Iron Ring in the north of Wales was Conwy, Harlech, Carnarvon and Beaumaris, the latter of which was never completed and survives today as an unfinished blueprint of a perfect late 13th century concentric castle design. Many of the Norman motte and bailey castles had their wooden palisades rebuilt in stone with crenellated battlements and walkways, with tall towers guiding every corner and making it more difficult to lay siege to the walls, as the towers were built to flank the part of the wall it was protecting, meaning any attackers scaling siege ladders could be shot at from above and from the sides. Large overbearing gatehouses, often built with drawbridges, portcullises and heavy gates, made up the only entrances to the castle, and therefore were often the most well-defended building in the entire castle complex. As can be seen here in Caerphilly, where a drawbridge opens up to multiple obstacles such as gates and portcullises as previously mentioned, as well as several murder holes, arrow slits and guard rooms, making the Gatehouse Avenue a truly gruesome death trap. As King Edward I quashed various Welsh rebellions with his mass castle building projects, he proved that the 13th century truly was the pinnacle of castle construction techniques. But as castles became more formidable, so did the siegecraft. In 1296, the First War for Scottish independence broke out, caused by an issue where 13 claimants to the Scottish throne had to prove themselves to the English King Edward. Edward wanted to make sure that whoever was crowned the next King of Scotland would surely bend the knee to him, so he may treat Scotland like a client kingdom. One of the 13 claimants, John Balliol, was crowned King of Scotland and agreed to Edward's demands. This was, however, until the English king requested soldiers to accompany him in a war against France. Scotland had special ties with the French, which meant that John was not prepared to send Scottish soldiers to take part in a war against a very influential ally. King John therefore refused Edward's demands, and made plans with the French to jointly invade England to topple Edward's hierarchy over both Scotland and France. As the English heard about this grave decision, they bolstered up their northern castles around Northumbria and Cumbria, as well as having one of their English armies march north. By this time, many Scottish castles had also been influenced by English and French defensive architecture, so King Edward brought a custom-made siege weapon along with him, a giant counterweight trebuchet named Warwolf. Warwolf was an incredible feat of medieval siege technology, capable of hurling heavy rocks with great accuracy. Of course, the point of a trebuchet wasn't to throw particularly large rocks. Indeed, the majority of ammunition was no larger than a modern bowling ball. Instead, the trebuchet's true power came from the ability to strike the same area over and over again, as the physics would almost always be largely the same with each launch. This meant that, once the mechanics had worked out the correct trajectory to hit a gatehouse for example, they could pummel it over and over again until it broke, and allowed access for the army to advance. Warwolf was largely responsible for the surrender of Stirling Castle in 1304, and the English would go on to take even more castles in Scotland as they continued their war with the Scottish. The Scottish did see some success against the English at the Battle of Stirling Bridge in 1297, but in 1305 the leader of the Scottish army, William Wallace, was captured and taken to London where he was executed and dismembered. His body parts bolted on the front of various gatehouses around England as a public warning for the consequences of taking up arms against the English king. Edward I received the nickname Hammer of the Scots for his particularly ruthless war against the Scottish, but he died in 1307 and his son would become Edward II. Edward II, however, was nothing compared to his father. He was not a good military leader or politically intelligent. He made many mistakes and showed poor character traits throughout his short reign, making his army lose the Battle of Bannockburn against Robert the Bruce in 1314. King Edward II failed to make any meaningful progress in Scotland, and was later forced to sign a truce with Robert the Bruce. He was also later overthrown by his wife, Isabella, who was the daughter of King Philip IV of France, and was allegedly tortured to death at Berkeley Castle in 1327. Things weren't all bad for England. The 12th and 13th century saw an explosion of trade and wealth for the kingdom. England had become the epicentre of the wool trade and had hundreds of busy ports to export all sorts of commodities from wool to illuminations. Countless abbeys and priories were set up all across the country, the monks and abbots working tirelessly writing books, tending to farms and building hospitals and schools for the local population. England was in its golden age by the 1300s, which was certainly needed to fund its near-constant on and off again war with France. By the beginning of the 14th century, the vast majority of the countryside was farmland, a mix of fields for crops, pasture for livestock, and areas reserved for various construction materials such as timber, thatch, and fenlands. Medieval England was a powerhouse, truly a power to fear on the European stage. Despite this, things were changing and would make trade a lot more difficult in some areas of England. In East Anglia, a region of enormous wealth and prosperity, and home to the city of Norwich, the second biggest trading hub in the entire kingdom, a natural phenomena was occurring of which the medieval people could not counter. The cliffs of East Anglia's coastlines are sedimentary, meaning that they are largely made of soil, chalk, and clay. They were therefore very prone to erosion, especially after harsh storms, of which the medieval period recorded many. So the sedimentary rock would fall into the sea and be swept along the shore sideways in an act called longshore drift. All this sediment being transported underwater would eventually reach the many bustling ports, and unfortunately fill the havenways, which are the dredged ditches underwater to allow for larger ships to navigate the waters around the port. The havenways filling up would temporarily halt trade along several harbours throughout the 14th century. This was less than ideal for the medieval people, as East Anglia had many thriving ports which were vital for the English trade, such as Orford and Great Yarmouth. Great Yarmouth especially used to be an incredibly popular trading hub, as ships constantly sailed from France, Holland, the Holy Roman Empire, Denmark, and even further afield, to trade with the English. Multiple additional havenways were dug out, but the effects of coastal erosion and longshore drift continue to plague East Anglia to this very day. Edward III was the new King of England, and in 1329 he found himself with a stronger claim to the French throne than the next French successor himself. Edward was the nephew to the current King of France, King Philip VI, whereas the next French successor, Philip of Valois, was the cousin to the king. The French court would not allow an English king to also sit upon the French throne, and as Edward owned lands in France, he was obliged to pay homage to the French king. This was something that Edward was not prepared to do. He arrived in France and paid homage to the king, but this was only lip service. After he pledges his allegiance, he turns his back on the French king in an act of disrespect and exits. In the years that followed, the French navy took this act of disrespect as an excuse to attack and burn down several prosperous English towns on the southern coast, including Portsmouth and Southampton, also including several settlements on the Channel Islands such as the Isle of Wight. In 1338, two large English warships were protecting a massive wool shipment from England to Flanders, but were intercepted by French ships, and the two English warships, named the Christopher and the Edward, were captured and now being used as part of the French fleet, a very painful embarrassment to the English. 2 years later, on the 24th of June 1340, the heroic English victory at the naval battle of Sluys led to the two ships being captured back by the English as well as many French galleons. In 1346, the English invade France by landing on the shores of Normandy with a giant fleet, and begins the initiation of a chevauchée, which is where an army spreads out across the enemy countryside, burning and pillaging every farmstead, every hamlet, every field and every town in an effort to apply maximum damage to the opponent. Soon after, on the 26th of July 1346, the English storm the city of Caen, displacing a large amount of French civilians, which causes great discourse towards not only the English, but also the French king for allowing this to happen to his own people. The English army continues to move east then north through the French countryside, continuing to pillage and strip every village and town of their resources, before pausing at Crécy. King Edward III himself then places each section of his army exactly where he wants them on top of the shallow hill, and orders his archers to dig holes in front of the whole of the English line, after which the army awaits for the French to arrive. Edward uses this time to review his entire army, checking their arms and armour to ensure they are all in good fighting state, ready for battle. The French arrived late in the day, at around 4 o'clock, and ordered their Genoese crossbowmen to run forward and gauge their range against the English army who were waiting at the top of the hill. The rain which occurred earlier that day caused the crossbow strings of the Genoese to lose strength, so their range was substantially affected by this. They kept moving forwards closer and closer until suddenly a hailstorm of arrows suddenly filled the sky from the English lines. The unfortunate Genoese, pushed forward by their French commanders without their pavise shields due to having no time to retrieve them from the supply wagons, were massacred. Soon after the initial arrow fire, thunderous booms shook the countryside, as, for the first time, the English had brought cannon to the battlefield. The cannons fired down on the Genoese, who turned and ran, being shot down one by one as they fled. The French heavy cavalry then engaged, charging up the hill with some reports claiming that the French knights were actually cutting down the Genoese themselves as they were regarded as cowards. The Genoese crossbowmen apparently turned round and shot back at the French knights, taking some down in an act of vengeance as they charged past, all while the English were looking down from atop the hill and were mocking them. As the French cavalry got closer, the horses began to fall into the holes dug out by the English, causing the knights to be flung from their horses and immediately cut down by the English knights who were waiting on the top of the hill with billhooks and poleaxes. Wave after wave of French cavalry continued to plough into the English lines, and vicious fighting ensued for multiple hours until darkness fell over the countryside, until finally the French commanders realised that victory was impossible, and so made the order to disengage, retreating down the hill to safety where they left the battlefield. In 1347, something is stirring in East Asia, which will bring mass devastation and death to Western Europe. Carried by the Mongols from China to modern-day Crimea, the plague spreads amongst the Mongolian hordes as they laid siege to a city named Kaffa. The citizens of Kaffa retreat by boat to Constantinople, where the plague explodes through the busy streets of the city. As many traders climb onto the various ships docked at Constantinople harbour, the plague spreads far and wide to almost every important port in Europe. By this point, it is no longer the rats who are the carriers. All tradesmen, merchants, sailors and captains who have come into contact with these plague ships are now infected, and they themselves are now the carriers. In October 1347, an infected ship arrives in Sicily and quickly spreads throughout Italy and reaches Marseille in France only a month later. By the summer of 1348, almost the entirety of Europe has been infected, and people begin to fall. The infected begin to suffer from sweating, muscular pains all over their bodies, vomiting and vertigo. Before long, buboes start to appear on the inflicted's body as the lymph nodes begin to swell. Agony would ensue before the sufferer would die within days of the buboes appearing across the body. People began to learn that the plague was spread by human contact, and so the many ports enacted a new rule called quarantina, which is where we get the word quarantine. Ships would be ordered to anchor outside the port for 40 days before entering and interacting with the locals. This seemed to have worked, as the plague would then not spread into the towns. Quarantine was soon practiced all across Europe in an attempt to combat the Black Death. Unfortunately, in many cases, this good work was faltered when certain people broke the quarantine rules and entered towns and cities while being contagious, which brought widespread death to many areas and prolonged the plague. By the time the Black Death had swept its way through Europe, approximately 50% of the population had been killed, and some places recorded up to a 90% fatality rate. Great Yarmouth, the prosperous port town in Norfolk that we mentioned earlier, was hit especially hard, with around 70% fatalities, as the port's success heavily contributed to its downfall. As the town's stone walls meant that the population were effectively boxed in, when the plague reached Yarmouth, it spread very quickly through contact between people, causing irreparable damage and was one of the first catalysts to Great Yarmouth's nearly 700-year economic downfall that followed. And so, by 1353, when the Black Death is said to have completed its swathe of carnage through England, the country was devastated and many people travelled to different towns and cities as their own settlements were essentially wiped out. We hear of plague villages dotted around Britain, which had become abandoned due to the high death rate, But these villages, like here in Runston, South Wales, were actually abandoned due to the deaths that occurred in nearby towns and cities, like, for Runston's case, Newport or Cardiff. The loss of life that occurred meant that the people of these small villages could move to the larger towns in order to look for work, as towns and cities were now in desperate need for skilled tradesmen and farmers to get the economy going again. It is due to this that we get a rise in importance for surnames, like Baker, Smith, Fletcher or Cooper, as they were occupational names and let strangers know what you did for a living. Everyone knew each other in small hamlets and villages, so they already knew your occupation, but when moving to a new town, it helped you understand what role you would be playing in upkeeping the local economy. The aftermath of the Black Death also paved the way for high earnings for tradesmen. Labour was in such high demand due to the high fatality rate, so people were prepared to offer higher wages and provide better job security through contracts than ever before. Not to mention that England was still deep in the early stages of a vicious on and off war with France during this time, so further military spending was required to continue the war effort. It should be noted that despite the official end date of the Black Death being 1353, the plague never truly went away and would continue to flare up multiple times over the next 300 years, and countries like France would consistently see plagues break out throughout its land.
The infamous 100 Years' War between the English and the French covered a total span of 116 years. Of course, it would be an impossibly long documentary to include every major event that took place during the war in its entirety. Needless to say, there were many sieges and bloody battles, such as the aforementioned Crécy, notably Poitiers, and of course, Agincourt. In 1415, King Henry V deployed an army, disembarking from Southampton, to land outside Harfleur, a prominent French port city. The city was considerably fortified, but Henry knew that if he took control of Harfleur, he would have a reliable foothold in a new area of France, which he could deploy his army from. A siege began, but ended with diplomatic negotiations where the city townspeople agreed to a peaceful handover of Harfleur. King Henry now had his foothold in France, but the French army was beginning to mobilise, preparing to combat the English incursion. Henry left a garrison of around 1,200 men to look after Harfleur. He also sent home around 2,500 men who had contracted dysentery during the siege, and were therefore likely to be a logistical strain on the army as it prepared to move out. He had around 17,000 men in total as he left Southampton, so now only around 13,300 men would embark on his campaign further into France. The English travelled around northern France just north of Paris and south of Calais, until the French army had finally caught up with King Henry. The English army was under one commander, King Henry V. However, the French army were made up of various smaller divisions led by many lords, princes and other veteran military commanders. Due to this, deciding on a battle plan proved to be a very difficult and dividing debate for the French. Finally, they had decided on a good battle plan, but unfortunately for them, an English scout managed to catch the French messenger holding the plans and took them to Henry. After reading what the French intentions were, King Henry set up his men in a way that would make the French army's battle plan impossible. He found a field between two woods which were between two villages, Agincourt and Tramcourt. The English army were then positioned in an inverted arc, with the majority of his men-at-arms in the middle and ordered to be dismounted. The entire English line was heavily made up of archers. Indeed, he even put archers in the wood lines, since he knew that the French cavalry would not be able to get them there. Henry then ordered his archers to chop down large logs and stick them into the ground to act as stakes to protect them from the cavalry charges. With his army now set up, Henry himself dismounted and placed himself in the front middle of his army as the French arrived. The French saw the English king in his finely polished armour, a golden crown atop his bassinet, and wearing the fleur-de-lis with his own Plantagenet heraldry. The French commanders were angered at his presence, as he appeared to have been flaunting himself to the French, mocking them. The French advanced. Their original plan was to sweep through the enemy lines with wave after wave of heavy cavalry, exhausting what they knew must have been an already very tired English army.
The previous night's rain had made this impossible, and the French knights knew this. Therefore, they opted to wear their armour in their heaviest configuration, as they knew they were going to be receiving a lot of arrow fire and were not going to be able to move forward very fast, effectively acting as sitting ducks for the English until they negotiated their way through the field. The French advanced and were instantly met with a hail of arrows. Indeed, wave after wave of almost constant arrow fire rained down on them as they dredged ever closer. Dr. Tobias Capwell made a conservative estimate that the English longbowmen were shooting around 15,000 arrows per minute at a steady rate. In the approximate 9 minutes it would have taken for the French knights to navigate the field towards the English lines, the longbowmen would have shot around 135,000 arrows in this time, assuming only the first 2 ranks were shooting. He also hypothesizes that the arrows roughly had a 4% fatality rate, meaning that the French suffered casualties either from death or serious injury of around 3,000 men in the initial advance to battle, which was around a third of their entire force. As such, the battle was immediately tipped in the English king's favour. Heavy melee combat followed, and surely was a brutal affair as no quarter was given. It was a fight to the death. Indeed, the English captured many French knights with the intention to ransom them. However, so many French soldiers were captured that Henry was forced to order his men to execute the prisoners, as fears arose of too many Englishmen needing to stay behind and guard the prisoners to prevent them from rallying, meaning not enough men active on the battlefield. After a long, bloody battle, King Henry V was victorious, and this proved to be one of the last victories the English would enjoy throughout the remaining years of a 100 Years' War. Henry V took part in various other campaigns around France following the Agincourt Campaign, but succumbed to dysentery near Paris in 1422, and was succeeded by his son, Henry VI, who, just like Edward II was to Edward I, could not hold a candle to his father's legacy. On the 22nd of May, 1455, a battle occurred which would kickstart a war which would end the medieval period as we know it. Tensions were spilling over as many members of the nobility became enraged at King Henry VI, continuing to lose land in France, as well as making multiple other political blunders and showing a lack of authority to rule the Kingdom of England. Richard of York, leader of the opposition to the king, marched his army to the town of St Albans in Hertfordshire, the second most popular pilgrimage town in England at the time. The Royal Lancastrian army had also marched upon St Albans, led by King Henry VI, to negotiate with Richard of York. It is unclear whether violent conflict was inevitable that day, but during the long morning of negotiations, King Henry had what is called a temper tantrum and dismissed the York heralds. This led to Richard of York abandoning terms and ordered an attack on the Lancastrian army. The First Battle of St Albans would have been one of the strangest battles to occur during the medieval period, as both armies were already inside the town walls at the time, with no need for a siege, with soldiers and baggage carts filling up the streets and the market square. The fighting would have indeed been fierce, and the battle was eventually won by Richard of York, whose men managed to capture King Henry VI and therefore triggered the beginning of the War of the Roses. And so the Kingdom of England would now see formidable armies march up and down the countryside for the next 30 years, with a uniquely high amount of pitched battles taking place as well as many sieges on English towns and cities. To discuss every notable part of the War of the Roses would take a tremendously long amount of time, but essentially we had two sides, the Yorkists and the Lancastrians. The Yorkists, originally led by Richard of York, a very wealthy and influential nobleman who was the Duke of York, York of which being a very wealthy and influential trading town and gateway to the north. Richard inherited his wealth and titles from his uncle Edmund, who had died at the Battle of Agincourt in 1415. Along with these riches came the title Mortimer, which had a stretched claim to the throne, a key point that Richard would use during his attempt to overthrow the king. Then you have King Henry VI, son of King Henry V, who led the triumphant Agincourt Campaign as mentioned earlier. Henry VI was not a military mastermind, nor was he politically minded. There were even doubts of him being sound-minded in general. Regardless, he was the king, and the English people took sovereignty very seriously. It was obviously treason for an Englishman to march an army against the King of England, after all. After the First Battle of St Albans and Henry VI's capture by the Yorkist soldiers, Richard had now catapulted himself to the regal role of England, indeed becoming the protector of the realm as a result of the Battle of St Albans. Margaret of Anjou, the Queen of England, became a prominent figure during the beginning of the War of the Roses, as she fought steadfast against the usurper Richard, decreeing that her son, Edward, Prince of Wales, should succeed his father as being the next rightful King of England. These tensions spilled over once more on the 30th of December 1460, where the Battle of Wakefield saw a Lancastrian victory. Both armies were largely made up of archers, being a typically English component after the evident success during the 100 Years' War. So now, thousands upon thousands of English and Welsh archers were pitched together in a hailstorm of arrows, with their commanders now using typically English tactics against Englishmen. During the brutal melee, Richard of York became trapped and he was slain on that day, confirming the Lancastrian victory. You would be forgiven for thinking that the War of the Roses would end there, just a short 5 years after its beginning, with Richard now dead. But King Henry VI was still not of sound mind, and the Prince of Wales was only 7 years old. The year that followed would host the deadliest battle to ever plague English soil, the Battle of Towton. It was a cold, stormy day on the 29th of March 1461. A blizzard was roaring throughout the countryside of Yorkshire, and a skirmish at nearby Ferry Bridge had made the Yorkists and Lancastrians battle-hardened on this wintry day. The Yorkist army was led by a contingent of notable members of the gentry, such as the Earl of Warwick, Baron Falkenberg, and the Duke of Norfolk. And the Lancastrian forces were commanded by the Duke of Somerset, the Duke of Exeter, and the Earl of Northumberland. The Lancastrians were situated favourably upon a hill, and began raining arrow fire down on the Yorkists. However, the blizzard was so intense that accounts mentioned that they could not see far enough to know where their arrows are landing. Unfortunately for the Lancastrian archers, their arrows began falling short, hampered by the winds which were against them. The Yorkist archers were now aided by the winds, and their arrows pierced the Lancastrian lines. This strategic advantage by the Yorks forced the Lancastrians off their defensive position on the hill. Gradually, the Lancastrian lines began to falter, and as their confidence wavered, they began to break rank and flee. The retreat must have been huge, as archaeologists have recovered many skulls with trauma to the back of the head, assuming they were cut down by the Yorkist cavalry as they ran. It would have been a brutal affair as they retreated down the hill to the river, in which they were forced to cross by jumping into the icy black depths, or stand still and be cut down. No quarter was given at the Battle of Towton, with both sides fully prepared to fight to the death. This barbaric agreement led to around 15,000 dead Englishmen by the time of the battle's resolution. And as such, the Battle of Towton, fought on the 29th of March 1461 on that snowy morning, remains today as the bloodiest battle ever fought on English soil. Throughout the following years, the Crown of England changed hands many times, becoming known as the Bloody Crown. There were moments of peace interspersed between the violence, but life in England was a very tumultuous time from 1450 to 1487, with law and order breaking down in much of the countryside. 1464 saw the Battle of Hexham. In 1465, King Henry VI was again captured and imprisoned in the Tower of London, where he would eventually die. 1468, a Yorkist army finally takes Harlech Castle after a long siege which possibly led to the infamous poem Men of Harlech. 1471, the Battle of Barnet led to a Yorkist victory, with the Lancastrian forces accidentally slaughtering their own men in the confusion of battle, hampered further by poor weather conditions. On the 4th of May in the same year, the Battle of Tewkesbury saw yet another Yorkist victory, straining the Lancastrian forces even further after their recent defeat at Barnet. A few weeks later, Henry VI was proclaimed dead in the Tower of London, with many questioning whether he was murdered following the recent Yorkist victories. In 1483, the Yorkist powerhouse were continuing to concrete their rule over the Kingdom of England. It was in this year that history delves into legend. Edward IV died in April, and his son, the 12-year-old Edward V, was due to be crowned the next King of England. Before the coronation, however, his parents' marriage was declared invalid, and therefore his heirdom to the throne was concluded as invalid as well. In a heinous act, his brother, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, proclaimed that he should be the next rightful King of England. And shortly after this proclamation, both Edward and his brother and other possible heir to the throne, Richard of Shrewsbury, suddenly disappeared from public view forever. It is generally thought that the Duke of Gloucester removed them and had them murdered in secret to prevent them from claiming the throne. It was, however, in 1485 where the tables had turned in favour for the Lancastrians. Henry Tudor led a formidable force against King Richard III, largely made up of exiled soldiers, loyalist knights, Scottish, French and Welsh mercenaries, and Yorkist deserters. On the 22nd of August, the two armies met at a place in Leicestershire called Bosworth Field. Heavy cannon were rolled up onto the hills overlooking the shallow valley, brought to the battleground by both sides, armed with 30mm to 97mm cannonballs. Lord Stanley's men made up a considerable number of Richard's Yorkist army, but he arrived at the battlefield as a neutral figure, standing atop a hill to the side of the theatre of conflict, and simply watched on. As Tudor's army marched towards Ambion Hill where Richard and his men were positioned, the first engagement began. Richard sent a messenger to Stanley, threatening to behead his son who was in his company if he did not take action and assist the Yorkist army. To which Lord Stanley allegedly replied, "I have other sons." Angered by his response, Richard gave the order to behead his son there on the battlefield, but his men refused as both Stanley and his son were a valuable asset and this was not the time to be hasty. The Battle of Bosworth was fierce and began to ebb in favour of Richard, who was overpowering the composite forces of Henry, who was also trying to persuade Stanley's allegiance. No response came from the figure still standing atop the hill. Henry Tudor himself was caught up in a melee, coming dangerously close to being cut down. The Yorkist cannons rained fire down on the Lancastrian forces as they manoeuvred around the bottom of the hill to avoid the wet marshy areas. The constant harassment from cannon fire decimated Tudor's forces as they were locked in combat. Meanwhile, Stanley continued to watch, standing still atop the hill. Richard saw Henry on the battlefield and charged at him with his household guard, hoping to slay the leader and end the battle. Henry dismounted and camouflaged himself within his army, making him less of a target. Oxford marched his pikemen towards the Yorkist charge, acting as an obstacle and buying Henry precious time to get in a safe distance where he was still in control of his army. Richard, so caught up in his attempt at capturing Henry Tudor, soon realised that his household was now dangerously separated from his main forces, and soon found himself in direct company with mainly Lancastrian soldiers as opposed to his own. It was in this moment that Lord Stanley finally engaged. Stanley charged down at Richard's household, swooping in and cutting down every last Yorkist soldier that got in his way. Richard's men were swallowed up by the Lancastrian and Stanley alliance, and Richard himself was butchered at the hands of the Lancastrian soldiers. As news of Richard's death cut like a scythe through the Yorkist army, they quickly held up their hands and disbanded, seeking to fight no more. Henry had won the day, and the War of the Roses was, at last, ended. In the years that followed, violence and disagreements did occur, such as the Battle of Stoke Field in 1487, but were largely fractured and quashed by the new king. Henry became King Henry VII and ushered in the Tudor period. And so, after just over 400 years, the Middle Ages was over.